Right now, across the Midwest, the Northeast, and the Mid-Atlantic, the same storms breaking apart the heat dome that has baked this country for weeks are themselves being treated as a serious, standalone danger by the National Weather Service, not simply a welcome cool-down. Severe thunderstorms moving along a cold front crossing the upper Midwest and the Ohio Valley are expected to bring flash flooding risk across those same three regions through today and tomorrow. At the exact same moment, just south of where that heat is finally breaking, forecasters are watching a tropical depression they expect to intensify into a full tropical storm. One already forecast to bring heavy rain and damaging wind to the Gulf Coast, anywhere from Texas to the Florida Panhandle. And in the middle of the country, before this latest system even arrived, heat indices in southern Illinois, western Kentucky, and southeastern Missouri were still reaching 116 degrees, hot enough for extreme heat warnings, even as the storms meant to finally break that heat were already forming to the north. If you have spent the last several weeks waiting for this heat to end, here is the uncomfortable truth meteorologists are trying to get ahead of right now. The moment it does end is not the moment the danger ends with it. It is the moment an entirely different, in some ways more immediately dangerous phase of this same weather pattern begins. This is the story of why the calm after a heat dome breaks is not actually calm at all, what is building directly behind it, and why scientists tracking this pattern are genuinely uneasy. No hype, no exaggeration, just what the data from the National Weather Service, AccuWeather, and the meteorologists actually tracking this pattern are saying. If the heat has just broken where you live, or if storms are rolling in, behind it, right now, drop a comment and tell me what it looks like outside your window. I read every one of these. If you want grounded weather coverage instead of panic headlines, subscribe. It is free. An A-like helps this reach people before the next wave arrives. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. To understand why the transition out of a heat dome is genuinely more dangerous than it sounds, you first need to understand what weeks of extreme heat actually do to the ground underneath it. A heat dome does not just raise the temperature of the air, it bakes the soil beneath it, and prolonged baking makes that soil measurably less able to absorb water, sometimes described as becoming hydrophobic, meaning rain that falls on it runs off almost the way it would off pavement rather than soaking in. This region has now been through this exact heat dome pattern more than once this summer, first over the east in late June and early July, then rebuilding over the west in mid-July with all-time record highs in Salt Lake City and Billings, and now settling directly over the Midwest and Plains corridor most recently. Ground that has been alternately baked and only briefly partially rained on across three separate cycles of this same pattern is exactly the kind of ground that turns a normal, even beneficial, thunderstorm into a flash flood risk serious enough for the National Weather Service to specifically call out. And it is precisely this kind of terrain, rather than an unusually intense storm on its own, that has turned several otherwise ordinary summer storm systems into genuine flash flood emergencies this year. This is precisely the setup unfolding across the Midwest, Northeast, and Mid-Atlantic right now. The storms currently breaking the heat dome apart are riding along a cold front that pushed across the upper Midwest and down through the Ohio Valley, and forecasters have flagged flash flooding as a genuine, specific risk through today and into tomorrow across that same corridor. Scattered severe thunderstorms were already moving through Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan, stretching east from the Ohio Valley into the mid-Atlantic. Washington, D.C., and Baltimore are expected to see bouts of heavy rain moving into midweek, with eastern Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland likely to see the heaviest totals. None of this is the gentle rain that ends a heat wave in the movies. It is a genuine, severe weather threat, riding directly on the back of the exact heat dome it is finally breaking apart, arriving on ground considerably less prepared to handle it than it would have been at the start of summer. Wildfire smoke drifting into the mix in some areas has added a further complication, meaning some communities are effectively juggling three separate hazards: heat, flooding rain, and degraded air quality within a single week. While that transition plays out across the middle and eastern parts of the country, an entirely separate threat has been organizing to the south, and its timing could not be more directly connected to everything described so far. Forecasters are currently watching a tropical depression in the Gulf that is expected to strengthen into a tropical storm, carrying heavy rain and damaging wind toward the Gulf Coast somewhere between Texas and the Florida Panhandle. This follows the exact pattern this channel has tracked for weeks, a Gulf system organizing almost precisely on schedule with this year's Atlantic hurricane season, even as a rare combination of a cooling Atlantic Niña and a historically strong Pacific El Niño has been suppressing the broader season's overall storm count. That suppression was never a guarantee against individual systems, and this developing storm is exactly the kind of real-world reminder meteorologists have kept repeating all year: a quieter season on paper, has never meant a season without genuine dangerous storms for whichever community stands and whichever system does organize. A system currently classified only as a tropical depression can strengthen considerably faster than expected. The same lesson behind Hurricane Otis, and a reminder that a modest current classification is a snapshot of confidence rather than a guaranteed ceiling. Here is the part of the story that genuinely deserves the word trap in its title, and it has as much to do with human behavior as it does with atmospheric physics. After weeks of extreme heat, dominated by headlines about record temperatures, heat advisories, and a rising national death toll that had already reached at least 40 confirmed heat-related deaths earlier this month, the arrival of cooler air and rain understandably registers as relief. People let their guard down. Outdoor plans that were paused during the worst of the heat resume. Attention that had been locked onto heat safety, hydration, and checking on vulnerable neighbors shifts elsewhere, precisely at the moment a very different, equally serious hazard is moving in directly behind it. Flash flooding kills people every year, specifically because it is underestimated in exactly this way, treated as an afterthought to the heat wave that preceded it rather than as its own distinct, immediate danger deserving the same level of attention. Public safety officials have pointed to this exact psychological pattern for years, noting that the emotional relief of a heat wave finally breaking can lower a person's guard at precisely the moment a flash flood warning, tornado watch, or tropical storm advisory most needs their full attention, a mismatch between how a threat feels and how dangerous it actually is that shows up again and again in post-disaster reviews of exactly this kind of transitional weather event. There's a genuinely important lesson in how this pattern has now repeated itself across the entire summer, and it is worth naming directly rather than treating each new heat dome cycle as an unrelated, isolated event. This is now the third time this year that a major heat dome is broken down into a significant secondary hazard almost immediately afterward. First, when the eastern heat domes break down in early July, triggered severe storms and over 1 million power outages. Then, when the western dome's eventual breakdown fed directly into monsoon-driven dry lightning and dust storm risk across the southwest. And now, as this Midwest and Plains dome breaks down into flash flooding across 3 separate regions, while a tropical system organizes in the Gulf at nearly the same moment. That repetition is not coincidence. It reflects the same underlying atmospheric engine driving this entire summer, an unusually strong El Nino and record-breaking ocean heat that has kept loading each successive heat dome with more moisture and more instability than a typical summer pattern would produce, meaning the transition out of extreme heat has consistently proven at least as dangerous in a different way as the heat itself, viewed together rather than as 3 separate news cycles. These 3 transitions form a genuinely consistent pattern. One meteorologists say is likely to keep repeating in some form for as long as this summer's underlying atmospheric setup remains in place, which current long-range outlooks suggest could extend well into August. Meteorologists tracking this pattern have also flagged something worth taking seriously about how long this particular cycle could last, since the picture is not simply heat-breaking, down cleanly into a single round of storms and then clearing entirely. Forecasters have described the potential for a bulge in the jet stream to redevelop as high-pressure rebuilds behind this latest round of storms, which could allow a version of this heat dome pattern to persist in some form well into the weeks ahead, rather than dissipating for good after this single transition. That possibility matters directly for how seriously this week's flash flood and tropical storm risk deserves to be taken, since a pattern capable of rebuilding itself is also a pattern capable of loading the same saturated ground with yet another round of heavy rain before it has any real chance to dry out and recover its normal capacity to absorb water. Drought conditions are also expected to expand across parts of the Central Plains, even as flash flooding threatens areas just to the east, a genuinely uncomfortable reminder that a single summer and even a single week can produce both extremes simultaneously in different parts of the same broad region, depending entirely on which side of a given storm track a particular community happens to sit on. So, what does all of this actually mean for you, whether the heat has just broken where you live or you are watching this system build from somewhere still waiting its turn? If you are anywhere across the Midwest, Ohio Valley, or Mid-Atlantic right now, the practical priority is treating the current flash flood risk with the same seriousness the heat itself received over the past several weeks, checking local National Weather Service alerts directly, rather than assuming the worst has already passed simply because temperatures have dropped, and never driving through a flooded roadway regardless of how familiar that stretch of road normally looks, since it takes only about a foot of moving water to sweep a vehicle off the pavement entirely. If you live anywhere along the Gulf Coast between Texas and the Florida Panhandle, this developing tropical system deserves genuine attention over the coming days, regardless of what it is ultimately named or how strong official forecasts eventually rate it. since heavy rain and damaging wind do not require a storm to reach any particular category before becoming dangerous. And it is worth having a basic plan in place now, while the system is still just a depression, rather than waiting until it has already strengthened to figure out where you would go if conditions worsened quickly. And regardless of where you live specifically, the broader lesson from this entire summer is worth carrying forward. The end of a heat wave is not the end of the story. It is frequently the beginning of its next, differently dangerous chapter. And treating a cool down as an automatic all clear is exactly the assumption this pattern has punished again and again since early June. The honest, grounded summary of this story is this. The same heat dome that has kept the Midwest and Plains dangerously hot for weeks, with heat indices reaching 116 degrees in parts of Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri, is currently breaking down through severe thunderstorms, carrying a genuine flash flood risk across the Midwest, Northeast, and Mid-Atlantic, arriving on top of ground already worn down by 3 separate heat dome cycles this summer. At almost the exact same moment, a tropical depression in the Gulf is expected to strengthen into a tropical storm, bringing heavy rain and damaging wind somewhere between Texas and the Florida Panhandle. A real-world reminder that this year's broader hurricane season suppression has never meant individual storms stop forming. Forecasters have also flagged the possibility that the underlying heat dome pattern could rebuild itself in some form in the weeks ahead, potentially persisting well into August, rather than clearing for good after this single transition. None of these threats are separate stories arriving in the same week by coincidence. They are connected phases of the same underlying pattern that has driven this entire summer, tied back to the same historically strong El Niño and record ocean heat this channel has tracked since June, and the calm that follows any one of them has, so far, never actually meant the danger had passed. We are going to keep tracking this transition as it unfolds, sourced the same way we did today, straight from the National Weather Service, AccuWeather, and the meteorologists actually watching these systems in real time, not recycled headlines dressed up as breaking news. Subscribe so you do not miss it if that Gulf system earns its name over the coming days, because based on how closely this pattern has tracked its own history all summer, that update likely will not take long. And leave that comment below. Tell me whether the heat has broken where you live yet, and whether what came right behind it caught you off guard the way it has caught so many people off guard already this summer. Because behind every one of these forecast maps is a family in the Ohio Valley, checking flash flood warnings they assumed were behind them for the season, a forecaster in the Gulf watching a depression organize almost exactly on schedule, a driver somewhere deciding at the last second whether that stretch of road really is as flooded as it looks, and a stretch of soil somewhere in the Midwest that has now been baked and flooded and baked again 3 times over in a single summer that refuses to give anyone a clean, uncomplicated ending. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.